r/nosleep. Posted by u/likeeyedid. My neighbors take the curfew a little too seriously. Sanctuary Hills is not a place but a religion. Sanctuary Hills had taken over my mind, as it does with anyone that stays too long to only be a guest. We all are swallowed by the need for the neighborhood to be perfect and right. There is not one person, not a community or a committee deciding on the rules. No, they are part of the grounds and the air and the water in this particular place. I haven't quite understood why and when this all started, but I do know that anyone that lives inside the gates does whatever they can to feed it. To make sure that everything here stays the way it has been. Some do by choice, for others the choice is made. I suppose for the people here Sanctuary Hills is not a place, it's a religion. They all believe in it, but they have different interpretations about how to do right by their belief. Naturally, they have different approaches to feed the sanctuary. There are the ones that religiously make sure that the number one rule of the curfew is being obeyed, though that is not the only item they take care of. There are more customs that to this point I hadn't met but soon would. And then there are the ones that are trapped, that know of the rules, that possibly broke them and now would not be able to go either way, and so they trick anyone new that seems to be an easy target. I don't believe their intentions are inherently evil, no, they are simply bored. And boredom can, despite its connotation, be a very dangerous emotion. Harold and Trudy were rule sticklers. Jack was bored. Of course, in this scenario, we have the added factor of Sanctuary Hills scrambling minds. Sometimes a little and often a lot, and therefore it is difficult to say what and who is right without having a neutral or even believable source. Although I did find one person who, as I'd mentioned before, should have been scaring me because they were dead. However, I suppose at this point I had realized that more residents inside these gates were long gone, but their spirits were still going strong. Which takes me back to when I saw him out there on our lawn. My grandpa, who used to write me letters and put candies inside the envelope, and who would encourage me to do what I needed with my life whenever my parents gave me another hard time. And who I felt so incredibly guilty about for not visiting more, especially when I heard the news that he was now gone. Maybe the guilt is the reason that brought me here. Maybe that's why I didn't think during that particular moment either. Why I didn't use my manipulated mind. No, I mean my conscious one, of course. Was that my own mind making a blank, or was it Sanctuary Hills? I actually believe it was the first. Well, I did something stupid, I can't deny that. It was just after 9 or 10 maybe, the exact time doesn't matter, but it definitely was dark out, and that's what should have stopped me. The sun had disappeared just before the creature appeared on our lawn. And I opened the door. Charlie. His voice sounded different. Or maybe I didn't remember well, because the last time I heard him it was only over the phone. I thought he looked odd. Well, of course he looked odd. He was dead after all, but that's not what he looked like. He was different because of his face. The clothes were the same, well, familiar at least. A checkered shirt and brown pants, and colorful dispensers as you don't see them on people often anymore. He waved and another tear rolled down my face. My vision was focused only on him and I forgot anyone else around. All the terrifying creatures that I couldn't call human anymore were gathered out there while trying to lure me out or force me to stay inside. Listen to your heart, that's what they say. My heart was telling me to run to my grandpa and ask him to make everything okay. I took a step. One step, and I swear it was tiny, but technically I was outside when I wasn't supposed to. Grandpa smiled and I saw Jack move closer, and he seemed kind too. That's what should have stopped me, but they didn't, someone else did. It was Trudy. She had come far too close again. I hadn't noticed because I was distracted by the look of my deceased grandfather on the lawn. But now she was so close to my face that I could feel a cold breath coming from her mouth, or maybe from the air. Her eyes were opened wide, and while she didn't stop smiling, her face appeared furious. Furious enough to crack even more and almost splinter into 1,000 pieces. "You're in awfully lot of trouble, young lady, and you better change that sooner than later," she whispered in a high-pitched voice. And then she pushed me with unbelievable strength. The door slammed shut. Trudy was gone, but Harold glued his face back to our window. When I fell back and the door was closed, I suddenly felt a sharp pain. Not from my elbows, which I fell on, they hurt a bit but not as much as my ankle. When I pulled up my pants just enough to see what was hurting, I saw the bloody imprint of a hand. I hadn't felt a thing when I was out there. "Go away!" I cried and shouted towards Harold as I slammed my fist against the window in his distorted face. I didn't want to see him, I wanted to see my grandfather. Listen to your heart, they say. However, it doesn't really make sense because your emotions are not in your heart, they're in your brain as well. It's all just a trick. I suppose in those tiny moments in which I had a clear thought, they weren't many as my surroundings did their best to scramble them, I felt punches in my gut. The ones that told me, not now. I felt Grandma's breath in my neck and I knew she was thinking of going out there herself. Even after seeing my ankle. Maybe, she whispered, they are all out there after all, how dangerous can it be? I understood her logic. It seemed perfectly understandable because it wasn't intrusive. The intrusive thought was the one telling us to stay inside, we simply weren't quite sure which one to listen to as neither seemed to be our own. One voice came from the inside. It was the sanctuary telling us to stick to what we ought to. But then there were the outside voices mocking our fear and telling us to come to play. He wouldn't do that to us though, would he? No, certainly not. He was a kind man with a warm heart that now has turned cold. He would protect us. Cold or not, Grandma said. I suppose deep inside she knew the truth. She knew, but she didn't mind a little lie as long as she could still see him from time to time. It's what made Sanctuary Hills her place. Even if it was fake. Even if that man out there wasn't Grandpa, and not his ghost either. The man out there in fact wasn't a man. Like the basket and the pictures from the cameras, he wasn't right. He wasn't there. They wanted to lure us out to our demise. All right, Grandma. What do we do? Oh, honey, there is only one answer to this question at this particular time of night. We keep our doors shut and go to bed. Tiny twitches and micro-expressions showed me that she was still inside that shell. The sanctuary hadn't consumed her entirely. In the morning I spent another hour or two making phone calls, but hearing the voices of my loved ones saying only nonsense and wrong things tore me apart even more. The only thing they listened to and responded to normally was the question of whether they should come visit. And I always said no. Not until I knew what fate they might meet inside the gates if the neighbors found out. I could already picture Jack licking hips on the prospect of fresh blood and corruptible minds. All right, hun. I'm off to the market. Do you need anything? Grandma called out from the hallway. For a split second, I wondered if everything was normal and I was the weird one. She said it so casually as if the past nights and days didn't happen. I jumped out of bed and ran towards the door where Grandma was putting on her coat. You are what? I shrieked. Sweetie, are you alright? Do you want me to pick up some medicine? Or possibly some fresh ginger and lemon, that always makes me feel just great. You're going outside? Why yes, it's the middle of the day, silly goose. Why wouldn't, and by the pale look on your skin I would suggest you get some of those rays of sun on it yourself. My gaze shifted towards the window and I saw the lawn, all green and pretty. The sun was shining. It was a beautiful day. Perfect weather for the pool. Grandma smiled, and then she left before I could stop her. Everything was normal. It always was normal when it was day, not entirely normal as it is in other places, but normal enough for Sanctuary Hills. The postman was filling peculiar mailboxes, children were playing hopscotch, garbage was being collected. I decided to get dressed and go to the market as well. 1. Because I didn't like the thought of Grandma alone, and 2. Because on my way I would also check the gate with the security guard out front. To see what an escape might look like and if I'd even need one in the middle of the day before the curfew begins. Maybe I could somehow go and get help or make a plan to free Grandma before my mind is taken over by the neighborhood. Grandma was long gone, so I had to get dressed quickly and hurry to meet her there before she went someplace else. She didn't even ask if I wanted to come along. On my way out the door, I found a card. I'd received a few ones like this before but usually had just pinned them to the fridge to forget about them. It was another invitation. Dearest neighbors, Abigail and Charlotte. What a pleasant weekend for a lovely midday barbecue in our greenest garden. Yes, you are thinking right, we would like to invite you to another party tomorrow at 2 p.m. sharp. We know it's very last minute, but we do like to be spontaneous. Make sure to be on time because as you know, time is scarce. You may bring your swimsuit, but that's up to you. Besides bringing good fun, a dish of your choice would be swell. See you tomorrow. Certainly, not possibly. Trisha, Tony, and Tina. I stuffed the card in my pocket and made my way to the market. The letter distracted me enough so that I left the doorstep without hesitation. I had been afraid of the thought before, but now I was outside and it seemed alright. I ran all the way to the market and on my way I could swear I saw Jack sitting on a porch, winking at me grinning, but I ignored him and ran even faster until I made it to the marketplace. I'd never seen the market before. It was like a farmer's market with fresh produce being sold as well as little whimsical products. From further away it looked really nice and inviting, but that was just from the outside. As soon as I stepped inside the marketplace everything appeared just a little wrong, as it does in Sanctuary Hills. And the longer I stayed, the more the little wrong turned into horribly frightening. I recognized a few faces from around the neighborhood but nobody who I'd ever talked to. I've never exactly been the kind of person to talk to neighbors much, and after this experience, I don't think I ever will be. I kept my eyes open for Grandma but couldn't spot her anywhere, so I decided to stroll through the narrow passages. From far away it appeared as if there were a dozen stalls, tops. Now that I had actually walked inside the first passage, it changed entirely. Everything did. There were many people, goods, stalls, and games. Almost like a beautiful oriental market with lots of colors and products, but it couldn't in any way be possible. I had just entered a labyrinth with fragrances and images too sharp to be real. In all its wrongness, however, it was perfectly right. A perfect market would suit a perfect neighborhood, and if the space wasn't big enough, then that fact would simply be changed. Perfectly reasonable for the sanctuary logic. I walked towards a stall with the most delicious scent that I had ever smelled in my life. It reminded me of days in the kitchen with my mother when we would bake and cook all days before Christmas. Only as I got closer I realized what it was that smelled so dangerously delicious. It was coming from a booth where a man sold jars filled with something I couldn't recognize from far away. I only followed my nose and not my eyes, but I should have focused on the latter. I truly should have, but I didn't because my mind was on the sanctuary autopilot again. Standing in front of the booth, I didn't look at the man but only at his products. I had to know what was inside these jars. Cinnamon, I whispered. It was the smell of cinnamon, except even sweeter and more intense. Delicious, isn't it? The sweet smell of death. I looked up towards the man who was dressed in a suit which didn't fit the market one bit. "Excuse me?" I asked. "The smell. We collect our items from a very special place, you see," he winked. "A special place? A different place? Have you left Sanctuary Hills, and if you did, can you tell me how?" I spoke without taking a breath. He didn't answer that question. Instead, he said, "Open a jar and your eyes will see what's inside, doll." I hesitated for a second but then opened the jar. Even though it was made out of glass, I didn't see what was inside from the outside, but when the lid opened I dropped the jar right to the floor. It was filled with eyes. Human eyes. Stuffed inside to the top. "You dropped it. How silly of you." I muttered. "It's okay, you can pay me back," he said with his eyes wide open. "Come back tonight and you can pay." He reached for my arm but I pulled away just in time and tried running away. I stumbled into too many people. Some apologized as if it was their fault and others whispered as they saw me, but I couldn't look at them. I had to get out, I just didn't know which way to go. I swallowed and kept going until I finally saw her. "Grandma," I cried and hugged her from behind. She stood in front of a stall selling jewelry. "Charlie, oh honey, how distressed you look. Are you all right, my sweet child?" "Oh, she does look awfully distressed but so very pretty. Is she your daughter?" the girl behind the table asked. She was young, possibly my age, but her clothes looked more like the ones of a housewife from the 1950s. Her caramel hair was curled up perfectly and her cheeks and lips were rose red. Grandma giggled. "Oh, Darla, you make me blush. No, this is my granddaughter. I've wanted to introduce you. Either way, she is so lonely here being young and new." "New?" a new voice said. A male voice. He had appeared from the side. I hadn't noticed him before. He had the same color hair as Darla but his clothes were far more normal. "Grandma, please let's go home," I whispered. I wasn't ready for meeting new crazy people. "Daniel, don't be rude and introduce yourself first, and also I tell you all the time, use entire sentences." Now she was looking at Grandma and shook her head. "I tell him all the time." She turned her head towards me and held out her hand. "I'm Darla and this is my twin brother Daniel." I didn't shake her hand. "Are you gonna ask me to come outside after curfew?" I asked. "Never," Darla called out, seemingly shocked. "Good neighbors obey the curfew," she said in unison with my grandma. I took a step back. "I'm sorry, love. I should take Charlie home. She hasn't been feeling too well these past few days, you see." "Will we see you tomorrow?" Darla asked with big eyes. "I always hope for friends my age at the garden parties, you see." She smiled and her eye twitched a little. "Yes. Please come. You must," her brother, who had been silent so far, added. He didn't smile and he didn't twitch but put much emphasis on the last word. He seemed the most normal, but so had Jack. I didn't trust the neighbors one bit. I couldn't care less about some barbecue. I wanted to take Grandma home and hide inside before the speakers started blasting the curfew call. The whole day had passed. Breakfast, the market, meeting the twins, dinner. My mission this morning was to get to the gate. To the entrance or preferably the exit. It was there in the back of my mind the whole time and still, I didn't move close to the gate even once. As if I had forgotten, but how could I forget the most logical thing to do? There is no way I would have just forgotten about that. The sanctuary didn't want me to take action. It doesn't want me to leave, and so it makes me forget. With a little help from the neighbors,